This is Fam Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Michelle Reittinger. And I want to make sure that I got that right. But welcome to the Fam Electric Ghost podcast. And how you doing today?
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to let people know we are a feature podcast on the Newsly platform. You can see that listen on Newsly up there. For people who don't know what that platform is, you can use coupon code GHOST and try it out for 30 days free. We'll be on Newsly later tonight. It's an audio only podcast platform, but you can check that out if you use coupon code GHOST. And we'll be on there later tonight. We are a featured podcast. So if you go to the featured podcast, you'll see that Family Electric Ghost is there. And I also want to let people know that we've got myupsideofdown.com as the URL. And you'll be able to click on that fully when we're published on all the major platforms. But so you don't have to remember that. It will be up during the whole episode, but that will be clickable. And we're going to talk about today is the topic that we've got is from suffering to thriving, how to heal bipolar disorder. So again, welcome to the Family Electric Ghost podcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
One thing we've been asking people lately, we've kind of learned over time being a podcaster, this is actually our episode 1056.
Wow.
We've been asking people what motivates you and why do you do what you do?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed with bipolar in 1998 and I pursued traditional treatment for the first 12 years. And I just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I ended up in the hospital multiple times. I made multiple attempts on my life because I just felt like I was never going to stop suffering. And my doctor and I found the first step to healing. And as I gradually started to heal, I wanted to share what I'd learned because I see so many people suffering with bipolar and people feel hopeless a lot of times. They feel like their lives are the best they can expect out of life is learning how to suffer well. And once I learned that it was possible to heal, I felt like I owed it to the rest of the bipolar community to share what I'd learned because I wish somebody could have shared that with me. So that's what drives me to share the things that I've learned because you don't need to suffer for the rest of your life. You can heal.
It's interesting sometimes, when you go to traditional medicine or Western medicine, sometimes they don't always have the answer. So because they're coming from such a very specific place. And what I've noted after talking to so many therapists and life coaches and people who have figured things out, that it tends to be like a holistic or naturopathic or things that maybe there's multiple legs. And sometimes, Western medicine has one leg to one pillar, and then they don't look at other things.
Yep.
Like the spirit and the mind and the body and the soul and things that are more esoteric, and then they don't consider those, and you don't have any kind of treatment plans. But if you think about Eastern philosophy or other philosophies outside of Western philosophies, they can pull those things in. So I was wondering, when you started to, lean into this and really start to figure out what's going on, what was your approach?
Well, initially my approach was just trying to survive. My third attempt on my life, I had kind of a spiritual experience where I was watching my children play. I had a 4-year-old little girl and a 2-year-old little boy at the time. And as I was watching my children play, I had a really clear thought come into my mind. If you ever succeed in ending your life, you will ruin your daughter's life. She will believe it was her fault and it will ruin her life. And so from that point on, I fully committed myself because I didn't believe my life had value, but I knew my daughter's did. And I thought, I will suffer for the rest of my life if it means giving her a chance at life. I didn't want to ruin her life. And so from that point on, I was just trying to find a way to survive. I didn't know it was possible to heal. And I was just trying to survive my life. But as I gradually started piecing together, like you said, this holistic approach, this integrated approach to dealing with my bipolar, I was gradually healing. And it wasn't until when I read, there's a book by Robert Whitaker, who was a investigative journalist, called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And what he discovered in that book, what he reveals in that book, through his research, is that what you're talking about is our Western approach to medicine kind of took shape in the early 1900s when they were discovering these magic bullet cures like penicillin.
Mm-hmm.
And it changed the entire focus of Western medicine to believe that there were magic bullet cures for every disease, every ailment that people had. And
Mm.
the problem that created was that they were looking for magic bullets and trying to find a quick fix to these complex problems. And it did a huge disservice, especially for people with mental health problems, because they couldn't identify what had caused these symptoms. So they lumped the symptoms together and then gave them mind altering medications. And it created chronic problems.
Yeah,
Peop
additional problems. You
Yeah,
have to
well,
take a
pe
pill that's resolved the first pill or the second pill or the
yes.
third pill.
Yeah. Well, and the thing the problem that this mindset has created is that the symptoms that we diagnose now as bipolar were extremely rare back in, 50 years ago. They were very, very rare, and they were not chronic. People that did display these symptoms rarely would have more than 2 or 3 episodes, and then it would self-resolve.
Hmm.
But once we started medicating it, it became chronic. It
Oh,
became a lifelong chronic deteriorating problem because we were changing the brain chemistry and altering it in a way that was not normal. And the problems that created the symptoms in the first place were not being addressed. So not only were you not addressing what caused you to become mentally ill in the first place, now we're complicating the problem with these psychotropic medications. So that's what
and
made
then
it
you become
chronic.
dependent. Yeah,
Yes.
then you become
Yeah.
dependent on that, and then you have, side effects, and then your
Yep.
body your pathways might get, like, used to getting the psychotropics.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then if you're stuck on that, it's like replace one problem with another problem without solving the root cause. And it's kinda
Yeah.
like when you deal with a lot of people, it's like, well, they're we have societies always looking for that magic bullet. I mean, even the people like in relationships are looking for their soulmate. They think
Yeah.
their soulmate's gonna fix everything.
Yeah.
And it's kinda like, as an artist, we kinda know we do a lot of self-examination. Like if you're a writer or you're a creator, like you look in the looking glass and you start to do a self-assessment. And a lot of times you dive into the things that might be dark or things that are scary or they're vulnerable. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we don't take that on because we're looking for the quick fix.
Yeah.
And anything that's going to work has to be sustainable, right?
Yeah.
It has to be something you could do probably for the rest of your life, not something you just do in 10 steps and it's done.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, I've spoken with a lot of people who are very artistic. It's interesting that people who tend to have mental health issues oftentimes are very artistic. And I don't know, I don't know, if there's a correlation other
Mhm.
than, it's a way for us to express ourselves. We feel very intense emotions. And so I think sometimes that lends itself to creativity. But I've heard people express concerns about healing because they're afraid they will lose that. And the thing that I always tell them is
Yeah,
that creativity, that source of genius is within you. You don't need the illness that is making your life very
exactly,
difficult
yeah.
in order to access that genius. In fact, I feel like you have greater access to the genius when you are feeling healthy, when your brain is healing. And I think when you do the work to heal, that it gives you deeper insight into yourself. It gives you, a broader life experience to draw from. So I always encourage people, please don't let please don't let that hold you back. Please don't let your identity become these symptoms. They're just a part of, the symptoms are an indication the brain is in distress
Mhm.
and it needs help. So let's get to what's causing those things to occur. You don't need to suffer for the rest of your life.
Well, you have this thing called, like, the tortured artist
Yeah.
effect. Like,
Yeah.
Tom I think, um, Rudri Tom Rudrigan,
Yes.
he came up with this idea, but it is a common kinda concept. They're like, if you think all your hits will come from melancholia
Yeah.
and you get happy,
Yeah.
then it's like, well, how are you gonna solve that? And I think that happens to some artists. It's like, I think it's the famous, like, I've seen fire and I've seen rain,
Yep.
right? As soon as he got happy,
Yeah.
people didn't like his records. Like when he wasn't talking about like the kind of tortured stuff he started at the beginning,
Yeah.
and he actually did songs that were more upbeat without
Yeah.
doing the self-analysis. The fans were like, I don't like that. And so then people like the artists get like, well, do I have to be in a total state of like chaos
Yeah.
to actually be in my art? And you don't. I mean, it's like your fans might want something. You don't have
Yeah.
to do it just because they want it. Like
Yeah.
you can kind of you have to evolve, and you have
Well,
to kind of get where you need to go, and you can't just satisfy certain sets of people.
and I think we have a tendency. I think one of the challenges that creates that scenario is when we're struggling with, really negative emotions, we have a tendency to gravitate towards things that validate those negative emotions. So if I'm depressed, I'll listen to really sad music, and it feeds it feeds the depression, it feeds the negativity. When you're manic, you tend towards like really intense emotion, things that inspire intense emotion. But I think part of the problem that we have in our society is that there's this hopelessness around mental illness. This paradigm of care where we're treating it with medications and people are not getting better. There's a hopelessness around mental illness. And so we feel like there's no hope anyway. So I want somebody to understand how I feel. But
Hmm.
if we can teach people a better way, if people can learn, you can actually heal. I love my life now. I would never go back to the way it was before. I am fully present for my children. The day that my daughter graduated from high school, I was sobbing with joy because I was so grateful I was there. I thought,
Yeah.
"My gosh, look how wonderful my life is now," and I would have missed all of this if I'd given up. I would have missed everything. And life can get better, and if we can provide people a path to hope, then maybe we can change the demand for those kinds of things.
Well,
You
I
know?
think, yeah, it's really important because mental health is not being considered like your regular health. Like if you look at a lot of people's health plans
Yeah,
and you try to go through Western medicine, they'll like say, well, you can do 10 visits for a mental health wellness. It's like, well, if you had a heart condition, you're gonna limit it to 10 visits
I know.
or 6 visits. Say they're not treating it like like the level it should be treated.
Yeah,
Like it's just like any just because it's mental health, it's not like it isn't diabetes, isn't heart disease, isn't lung cancer. It's like it's that stuff doesn't just go away. You just don't
yeah,
limit ration the care.
yeah,
And so we've got a system, that rations care based on what I don't know, some actuary figuring out what they think is important, but rather than actually. So that's why I think a lot of times people have to reach out outside of traditional medicine because if you got people just bean counters figuring out like what they want to pay for,
yeah.
well, that's not really going to solve your problem.
Well, and I think part of the problem too is that it's very expensive to have a mental illness right now. Because the treatment does not resolve the issue. People are, I was telling my husband one day, it was a few years after I got off of my medications and I started to heal. And I was looking through our budget, and I was recognized how little I was spending on mental health at that point. And I told my husband, I said, I feel like there's a financial incentive to keep us sick
Mm,
because I was, when I was really sick, when I was, using medications and that, I was in and out of the hospital. They did electroconvulsive therapy, which is extremely expensive treatment. My medications, at one point, I was on 7 different medications. And it's very taxing on on our healthcare system. And people who have mental illness, especially people with bipolar, on average, 83% of the people diagnosed and treated for bipolar with medication will become severely impaired, meaning disabled by the disorder. And it's because they're not helping people heal. They're creating a chronic problem. And so those people can't work. So we've got people who can't work. They have huge, medical bills. It's a massive drain on society and they're suffering. Their quality of life is in the garbage. And so we need to just shift. And one of the things, like you mentioned at the very beginning, we need to shift the way we think about this type of treatment, because I hate when people will talk about this as alternative treatment, because most of the things that I use to heal have been around for thousands of years. They are
yeah,
not alternative. The alternative treatment is actually medication.
yeah.
Medication has only been around for 50 years, whereas, the things that I use, mindfulness meditation, micronutrients, the only reason we need micronutrients now is because our food supply is so deficient in
Yeah, it's not
in the
homegrown.
nutrients that we need,
Yeah, it's
right?
not homegrown. We don't eat
Yeah,
enough veggies. We don't eat enough fresh foods.
yeah, and even
And
the
and
even the fresh foods are deficient in
well,
nutrients
yeah,
because the
because of
soil is so
fire.
depleted.
Well, the bioengineered, or they're
Yeah,
using the bad soil. And it's not like
yeah,
if you go like I live in New Hampshire, so we have a lot of organic farmers
mhm,
that have really good stuff. And you go to farmers market and they look, you're
yeah,
not getting your some from some big like corporate farm.
yeah,
Even the meat you can get like from an organic farmer. It's got grass fed. It's their field. It's not
Yeah.
Monsanto's field.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's
And
like, it's just it's hard to get that. Like, if you live in a big city, are you
yeah,
really gonna pay the extra for that for that thing? 'Cause now we have to pay so much money
yeah,
for, like, 50, 100, 70 years ago.
yeah.
That food didn't cost that kind of money, and it was better quality, but now
Yep.
we have to pay for this mass-produced stuff, and it's really hurting our bodies, and it
Oh,
is
absolutely.
I was like, one of your opinions about, like, modern medicine is giving you all these pills and all these medications, and then they're not considering the nutritional value of the food we're eating is causing the deficiency. So
Well,
where's that research being done, or are people actually pointing it out?
oh man, absolutely. So, and the interesting thing is that most psychiatrists are rejecting the research. They just won't even consider it, which is so it just makes me crazy. Medic doctors have no training in nutrition at all. I think there's
Yeah.
when I read there's a book. I'll show you the book. This is an awesome book. It's called The Better Brain. It's doctors Bonnie Kaplan and Dr. Julia Ruckledge, and they are pioneers in the field of research with micronutrition and healthy eating for resolving mental health issues. And they have done a ton of research. And when they were trying to expand the research, so when they first started doing the research, they were doing small groups. And then when they were ready to do the larger research studies, they were having doctors that were actively dissuading people from participating in the studies because they did not want to hear about it. They didn't want to hear that you could solve these problems with micronutrition. They were totally indoctrinated into this idea that bipolar and ADHD and chronic depression all were diseases that had to be treated with medication. And
Oh,
the thing that's
the
so crazy
funny
about that, well, the thing that's crazy about that is we know if you deprive your body of nutrition that it will start to suffer. You will start to have health problems. The brain
mm,
requires so much more nutrition than the rest of the body. It's incredible how many micronutrients your brain needs to function in a healthy way. And when your brain is not getting what it needs, if it's not getting what it needs, the things that are affected are the neurotransmitters that cause these kinds of symptoms. There's a direct correlation to the in this. And so these doctors have done a lot of research, and Dr. Kaplan is retired now, but Dr. Ruckledge continues to do research on it, and it's extraordinary. The application, one of the things that she's done a lot of research on is stress responses to major disasters. So she's done studies after she lives in New Zealand. So there, I can't remember if it was an earthquake or there was some kind of major natural disaster down there. And they did a study on how people stress responded to the stress. And they gave some of the people micronutrients, and the ones that had micronutrition were able to handle it without getting depressed, anxiety. It eliminated a lot of the issues people struggle with when they're under severe stress. And it was like this it makes sense if you think about it. Now that I understand these things, when I'm under a lot of stress, I need to give my brain more. When
mhm.
my husband lost his job at one point, it was a very stressful experience and I could feel myself starting to get depressed. And so I called the company that I use the nutrients through. And they said, you're under a lot of stress. Your brain's burning through the nutrients faster. You just need to increase your dose. I increased it. The next day I was fine. It's incredible because we like I said, we acknowledge the need for macronutrients like carbohydrates and fat and protein for our body. And if you completely stopped eating protein, you would have all kinds of physical problems with your body. The same thing is true for our brains with the micronutrition. If it's not getting enough, it's not going to function in a healthy way, and that's when you get mental health issues. That's when you get symptoms like depression, even manic problems can come from insufficiency in the micronutrition. It's pretty amazing science.
That's interesting because you kind of started to say many years ago, we didn't have as many people having these issues, and I would think probably has something to do with the nutrition and the diet and the food,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Because if you go back and humanity kind of knew when we were hunter gatherers and agriculture, like we knew what to grow, we knew what to eat, and
Yep.
then as industrialization happened, I think that's where the key core causes. Once you get industrialization, and you get industrialization of farming,
Yep.
and you get the biochemical industry getting into farming, and then your products,
Yep.
and they start giving us like garbage food or junk food.
Yeah.
And then
Well,
I think that's a core problem. Like on many legs, I've talked to a lot of people. Is like nutrition is such a big factor, and then a lot of doctors just it's poo poo. They foo foo. That doesn't mean anything because maybe they're not trained on it or they don't want to believe it
yeah.
because they're getting funded by the pharmaceutical chemical companies.
Yep. It's very true. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that's interesting in this book that they talk about is what we call food now often isn't food. So if you go to your grocery store, the outside of the grocery store, so you've got the produce section, you've got meat, you've got dairy. Those are whole food sources. Those are coming from the natural source. Yes, they're depleted. So
Mhm.
most of them are grown in high yield areas that they are not getting, they're not giving you the same nutritional value, but at least it's a whole food source still, right?
Mhm.
If you go into the inside of the store, you're getting highly
Processed
processed food.
processed food.
And
Yeah.
in this book, they say don't even it's not even we shouldn't even call it food because it's not really food anymore. It's
It's like
been
junk.
so highly processed that and when they put they call it fortified and things like that, but you've robbed it of all of the natural nutrition, and then you've processed it in the way that the body's not designed to consume. And so, of course, our brains aren't getting what they need out of that nutrition. And the interesting thing is, a lot of times when people, for me personally, I can tell you from my personal experience, when I was struggling with the symptoms, it started when I was in college. And think about college students, how they eat.
Yeah, you don't eat
You
that
leave
great.
home. I
Eat
was
pizza
eating I was
and
eating potatoes
burgers.
and top ramen and, like whatever was cheapest is what I was eating. And so it was like not there was no nutritional value. And then
Yeah.
you're under a lot of stress because you've moved away from home, you're out on your own for the first time. So there's a lot of stress. And I had trauma that I was dealing with that was untreated. And that combination was a perfect storm for me. And so that's a lot of times people who are having these kinds of issues then can't are having a hard time taking care of themselves. And so like I was feeding my family like microwave dinners
Yeah, it's
and so it was just really processed stuff. So it was compounding the problem because our bodies weren't getting what they needed to function. Our brains weren't getting what they needed to function in a healthy way. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors that have fed into this problem. One of the other factors that's interesting that they talk about in the book is genetic. So there's a family that the thing that first triggered the Dr. Kaplan's interest in studying micronutrients specifically for bipolar was a family who were the founder, the father of the family was the founder um, of this company, the micronutrient company, because he was trying to find a way to help his children. And they found in this family, I think he had like 10 or 11 children. Half of them had mental health issues, bipolar. I'm not sure what the other ones were. At least two of them had bipolar, but half of them had mental health issues. I think maybe all bipolar. His wife's family, half of 8 children, half of 8 or 10 children had it, and then one generation back, the same thing, 50% of the
oh,
kids in that family. And so they went through and they thought there's a genetic component here. And what they've discovered is that the genetic component is some people's brains need more. So some
more
people's,
food.
we're starting to learn, a lot of research about nutrition is starting to show that sometimes people's bodies need different balances, right? There's different kinds
Mhm.
of diets that work better for different people. It's the same thing for our brains. Some people's brains need higher levels of micronutrition support in order to function in a healthy way. And that's the case for my family. I have bipolar. I've got another sibling with bipolar, and I've got 6 siblings who are all diagnosed with ADHD. All of those are rooted in micronutrition deficiency. So,
I think it's really interesting because the one size fits all kind of science that's been going on for the last
yeah,
50 years is starting to change. There's a lot of medical advances that are realizing that you have to customize
yeah,
medicine to your unique DNA, right?
yeah,
That you might have to have a therapy that's based on your genetics. That
yeah,
you have to, so it makes sense that the food issue and the micronutrients would be the same thing. But the corporate world again then wants to make something that just applies to everybody
yeah.
because it's
Well,
like mass production. So mass production doesn't want to have the individual solution. But then when you find out where there's a problem, you have to go for individual solutions.
yeah, and that's one of the things that I feel like is so sad with the way that we approach mental health is that We don't look at the individual and get a history and say, okay, so for me, example, I'll tell you about my experience. So micronutrition was key, but I had unhealed trauma, and trauma is a key factor in causing these types of symptoms in people. If somebody has severe unhealed trauma, it causes emotional dysregulation and can trigger, somebody can have no problems with micronutrition and have these things triggered by severe trauma.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
so, so I had severe trauma for a marriage when I was really young, and I didn't talk to anybody about it. And when I went in, looking back now, it's very clear I needed micronutrients, I needed help with therapy, like trauma therapy, not just going in and talking to somebody, but going
Yeah,
to a
great
trauma
therapy.
therapist that knows
Yeah.
how to get to the actual problems and heal those problems. And then and then mindfulness meditation, which is not alternative. This has been around for thousands
Yeah,
of
so
years.
mindfulness is like, in Eastern philosophies, I'm a Buddhist. We
Yeah.
do a lot of things with mindfulness and chanting and regulation of our breath and
Yep.
just kind of positive mindset.
Yeah.
So it's not foo-foo. Like you can get the
No.
Native American. I'm part Cherokee and Blackfoot. And there's like a lot of indigenous cultures had
Mhm.
this like kind of mind over matter. If you visualize it, you will actualize it. If you speak it, it will make it happen.
Yeah.
So in the oral history of a lot of indigenous peoples is a lot of like actualization by speaking what you want
Yeah.
in some way. And then having that kind of positive mindset and then breathing and chanting or just focusing and then also communing with nature. But just these things that sometimes seem esoteric or foo-foo or kind of hippie like is like, no, that's part of like human culture. It's been around
Yeah.
for like thousands, if not, how long
Yeah.
we've been here.
Yeah,
And
and it's
then they kind of told you, oh, not, you shouldn't do that because that's not real. And
yeah.
it came from over there.
Well, and that's I think that's the challenge, like, you just going back to what you said at the very beginning. These are not alternative because they've been around for thousands of years. There's a reason that they've been around for thousands of years. They work. People, it helps heal people's brains. I didn't know anything about mindfulness. We have a society that is so fast paced. We've got all of this new technology that, and I'm not anti-technology, but we've got all
Yeah,
this technology that is,
right
we
now.
don't know
Yeah.
how it's messing with our brains. They're daily finding new ways that this is messing with our brains, right? And we don't know how to slow down. We don't know how to stay present. There's a lot of like social issues around shaming emotions, and that kind of thing. And so learning how to stay present with yourself, learning how to live in your experiences rather than daydreaming or escaping, those kinds of things, those help us to re-regulate our minds and our bodies. It helps us
Yeah.
it was crazy for me when I first started practicing mindfulness meditation. It was so uncomfortable. I was so uncomfortable.
Wow.
But as I continued to do it, because my mom kept telling me about it, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna try it. And the more I did it, it was life changing. And this is not hyperbole. I had become so disconnected from my mind and my body that once I learned how to stay present with it, was like all this new sensation, all this new joy. I felt like I could feel more than I'd ever felt before. I wasn't afraid of bad feelings. Bad feelings. I wasn't afraid of things that
Yeah.
were uncomfortable, and it helped me. I don't have anxiety issues anymore. I don't, when I get sad, I'm okay with it. It doesn't spiral into depression. So I feel like it's so important for us to stop looking at these as I'm not anti-medication, meaning I think that there is a place for medication. Like I'm so grateful for penicillin.
Yeah.
I'm thankful that we don't have these deadly diseases that we used to have, but I feel like they threw the baby out with the bathwater when they were trying to get rid of all of the old remedies and try to solve everything with a pill.
Yeah.
We really did our society a huge disservice, and now people are afraid of these treatments and these tools that have been around for thousands of years and are so helpful. We call it alternative medicine when
It's
it's been
original.
around for as long as people have been alive almost.
But it's like a lot of times people are trying, there's so much shaming on social media. It can cause
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
Man, they tell young people to be careful because you got all these influencers creating these idealized images, and teens are being shamed,
Yeah.
into thinking they should meet something that's like that. Well, that's artificial. That's
Yeah.
fake.
Yeah.
That's not real. Like, but people are being told in 30-second, 90-second bites,
Yeah.
this is what you should be. And then if you speak your mind, you get shamed and people, the haters come out. And so it's like a very bad experience. You go online, kids have died from the
Yeah.
bullying, from cyber bullying, from online, and it's real. It's like how people have to understand how real things are. Just because it's on the net doesn't
Yeah.
mean it's not real.
Yeah.
That can affect you. And there's a kind of disconnect between what, like, oh, words don't mean anything. Like, words mean a lot. And it gets some people to say, well, words don't have any effect. It's like you're missing the boat.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if somebody's, most of us have some kind of trauma in our lives, right? Some people have more severe trauma than others, but we can develop really unhealthy thought and behavior patterns based on those traumas. We have coping mechanisms that help us to deal with that. And then you've got all of this outside influence from social media that is feeding those, negative thoughts and feelings and it just escalates and spirals and people that's why our mental health problems are just out of control now. And I think the most important thing is to learn how to look at it differently. When we experience these symptoms that we have clustered and lumped into these categories, instead of looking at it as a disease or this disorder. I hate calling it bipolar disorder anymore. It just drives me crazy because it's not a disorder. They are symptoms that indicate the brain is in distress.
It's an
Just like if you're
imbalance.
running a fever, right? So
Yeah,
if I went to the doctor and I was running a really high fever and I had a really bad sore throat and the doctor just gave me ibuprofen and a throat lozenge and sent me home, maybe I'll be okay. But maybe I've got an underlying problem like strep throat that if it goes untreated,
yeah,
is going to develop into like life-threatening problems. And so with what we call bipolar disorder, somebody is struggling with underlying issues. And we need to look at that and say, okay, what are the symptoms trying to say? Instead of trying to shut the symptoms up, listen to what the symptoms are saying.
yeah,
Let's make sure your brain is getting what it needs to function in a healthy way. Do you have unhealed trauma in your past? Let's work with a therapist, a trauma therapist, somebody who knows how to actually resolve the problems and help you process and resolve unhealed trauma. Let's help you learn how to think in a healthy way. Let's work on mindfulness meditation and learn how to stay present with yourself and learn how to process and re-regulate your symptom, your body and your mind. Yoga. I'm sure you've talked with people about yoga, but I remember the first time that I cried in a yoga session, I was like, what is happening to me? I didn't understand what was going on. And it was the first time that I started to think, I wonder if there's something more to this than just, skinny women in yoga pants running around with their lattes, like there's maybe there's something more. And I started studying yoga more and learned so much about the benefits that come, somatic, it's used in somatic therapy for trauma. It's a really wonderful way for us to reconnect with our body, reconnect our bodies and our minds, and help us again, re-regulate our emotions. Um, yeah, so I feel like we just have to reframe what mental illness is so that we can actually help people heal rather than suffering for the rest of their lives.
yeah. We've been going through it. I mean, the fact is, like, you do have to have a connection to your body through
Mhm.
yoga or tai chi or the martial arts or whatever you do. Maybe just like learning how to get back in touch with the body, but you've been sedentary. Like a lot
Yeah.
of problems with our society is like they have the model like you should be in the cube for 8 hours
Yeah.
and do what the boss wants,
Yeah.
and you go to the coffee shop so you can be keyed up to stay in the cube
Yeah.
and not consider, well, maybe you need to take 15-minute breaks, maybe you need to walk, maybe you need to meditate. I was in
Yeah.
Japan and people would be like in these little parks in downtown Tokyo doing tai chi all
Yeah.
throughout the day,
Yep.
and people would go out and then get tea, different types of teas instead of coffee,
Yeah.
and they would be doing martial arts or tai chi or Shinto type practices, or there's something meditation. You would see it,
Yeah.
and you're in the middle of this big city, and people would just carve out the time
Yep.
to have time for themselves, even though they're like really on the clock. They still carved out the time for themselves, and I think
Yeah.
that's where the mistake that we make is we don't connect the body, mind, spirit, soul,
Yeah.
and this thing is like, well, I'm just gonna push it.
Yeah.
So we get to these burnout things where like, oh, I should just stay here for 8 hours, or I stay up all night doing this without having any balance,
Yeah.
without having any kind of recovery, not shaking anything off and saying, oh, you got to just suck everything up.
Yeah.
But if you don't, if you just suck everything up, and you never shake it off, and you never kind of give yourself a break, you're gonna break down.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that's really important too is learning how to let feelings happen. When we bottle them up, when we push them down, they just get louder. Feelings, emotions are just information. For years, I had, when I would have bad, I would call them bad emotions. I'm saying that in scare quotes because emotions aren't good or bad. They just are
Oh,
information. That's all they are, is information. It's your brain trying to communicate something to you. And when we don't allow those emotions to process, they become louder because your brain is trying to communicate something with you. And it's like a child that's screaming at, that's trying to get your attention and you keep trying to cover
yeah,
it up,
those are
cover up the
the
mouth. They're like, just get louder. They're like, no, I got to tell you something.
yeah,
And so it's the same kind of thing. Like if we don't take time to evaluate our lives, evaluate how we're doing, let those emotions process. If you're feeling something, why am I feeling that way? What's going on in my life that's making me feel that way? Kind of allow those things to go through. And most of the time I found that, what used to be uncomfortable emotions, once I let myself feel it, it would just go away. Once I received the information, my brain was like, all right, you got the message. I'm done, and the other thing is I feel like we're creating a class of victims. And I don't mean that in a mean way. Like I don't mean that in a way that is disrespectful. I went through this myself where we're telling people you are sick with something that is a disorder and I will fix it for you. And so it creates this helplessness in people
mhm.
and feeling of it disempowers people. Whereas I feel like
Yeah,
if
they
we
can't
can take
fix themselves. Yeah,
responsibility, yeah, we can take responsibility
yeah,
for ourselves. Like, how can I, like what you're saying, how can I choose to actively, to be active during the day so that I'm giving my body and my brain what they need to take a break? How can I take care of myself in a way that's going to nurture my emotions and, practicing mindfulness meditation, those kinds of things where we start to take ownership of what we're dealing with. And when we do therapy, instead of looking at it like I'm a victim and I can't, think of it like I'm going to use therapy as a tool and my therapist is a facilitator and I'm going to use that tool to heal. I'm going to use that tool to take back my life. If somebody's hurt me, I'm not going to worry about that person. I've been wounded. I'm going to focus on healing the wound so I can live a happy, fulfilling life rather than allowing myself to become a victim to this. And so I
yeah.
feel like,
I think we get on the train. Like if you're looking for that soulmate, you're looking for the other to help you.
yeah,
Where a lot of times it's like you have to start with like the self love.
yeah,
Like if you've had this thing where you're like you're an imposter syndrome, you don't believe you can't. If you have that, then you're always looking for this outside source, and you don't. It's like go back to poets because I'm really into poets. It's like the looking glass.
yeah,
The idea of the poets. It's like why do they always bring that up? Because you have to start with you. You have
yes,
to start, and then all the now the Victorian poets I used to read, Lord Byron and Wordsworth and Blake, they're always talking about this mirror.
mhm,
They're always talking about looking in that mirror in some way and finding something out, and then the vulnerability of that driving the work.
yeah,
And it was trying to like uncover like what is there, and it's not to like feel like you're a victim, but it's like you have to find that what's in within and bring it out, and then
yeah,
be able to go beyond it and get better.
yeah,
And it's kind of like the artist thing is like, well, you keep on doing things and you might fall down, but it's like steps on the rung to getting to a better piece of art.
yeah,
Is
and
that
it's
and
such a
that's the way in your life you can do the same thing.
yeah,
It's not falling down.
it's such a fulfilling way to live your life because you take ownership and you feel empowered. You feel like I have control. I don't have to, all these other people can do what they're going to do. And that's one of the things that you were saying about how if in order to, be able to interact with the rest of the world in a healthy way, I have to be healthy. I feel like a lot of times when we're struggling with our relationships with other people, often it's a reflection of our own issues, our own unhappiness with ourselves, our own, I had a very abusive marriage when I was 19 years old. And I didn't want it. Once I left, I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. My parents tried to
Mm,
get me to go to therapy, go to groups and stuff. And I'm like, nope, I'm never talking about that again. But I kept attracting
the
bad
same type of
partners after
person.
that.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn until years later that it's because your brain is trying to resolve the trauma, so it keeps putting you back in that situation to try and finish it,
Yeah,
close it off. And so I think when we're afraid to look inside and afraid to, or feel like a victim, like we're helpless, something's happened to us and we can't do anything about it, we spend the rest of our lives suffering. It's we can't really have you can't have a healthy relationship if you're not healthy. And
yeah,
often we won't seek out healthy relationships when we're unhealthy. And so learning how to take responsibility, learning what that looks like and how to do it is so empowering, because if you're willing to look inside, like you said, look in the mirror and do the work to heal and to become whole. And the other thing that's beautiful about that is when we do that, then we don't need other people. Like,
yeah,
it's the relationships become better because you're not in the relationship because you need that person. You're in that relationship because you choose that person.
yeah, it's a law of attraction. Like,
Yeah.
once you get like, as I believe in frequencies, because 'cause I'm a
Yeah.
synthesist, right? So, I
Oh,
deal with
yeah,
sound
absolutely.
waves and
Yeah.
oscillators, and I see the result of the different sound waves when I'm in front of an audience.
Yeah.
So, I kinda understand, like, if you have something that's very harmonious, everybody's waving their candle, everybody's swaying back and forth, and it's kind of like a love fest. But if
Yeah.
you come at it like with a punk aesthetic, people are kinda in the stomp pit and they're banging into each other. It's
Yeah.
aggressive,
Yeah.
and it really is a different waveform, and we're
Absolutely.
all living in frequencies, so I can make something very chaotic and very punk, and everybody's gonna be kinda, like, throwing themselves at each other. Or I
Yeah.
can do something that's very harmonious and everybody's, like, in a love fest.
Yeah.
And so, like, you can trigger different vibes based on frequency. So the same things with your voice
Mhm.
and your attitude, because your attitude as a person is putting out those vibes. You come into a room and somebody's got the dark vibe, you can kind of feel it.
Yeah.
You,
Absolutely.
you can read it. So I believe that stuff is not it's not foo-foo, it's real.
No, not at all. It's absolutely real.
And, and once you start to realize like your vibe is causing that laws of attraction. So if you're putting out a like discordant vibe, you're gonna probably have a discordant day.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Things aren't
Absolutely.
gonna be in line, it's probably gonna be everything's falling out, you're making mistakes, like, what's going on? You
Yeah.
come out with a more positive vibe, like a Bob Marley vibe, then you're gonna get, like, people coming around and they're happy and they're smiling at you and saying, like, "Why is that?" Well, 'cause you're generating that,
Yeah.
right? So then you're gonna get back that.
Yep.
That's kind of what it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, I think that because of all the noise that we have in our society, we've started losing touch with that reality. I think that, when you know what I mean by noise, like there's
Yeah,
just people are always on their phones, they're always, and so we're losing the connection and understanding of the vibration. We're losing the understanding of how our vibration is affecting our life and how, what I mean? So
yeah,
I feel like understanding those things, learning how to look in the mirror, like you said, and take responsibility for yourself and do the work to heal, it does absolutely attract, more of what you become, more healing, more, whole people. And one of the things that I had the best analogy, I had a trauma therapist on my podcast, and she was talking about how when we have unhealed trauma, that it creates kind of like a black hole in
mhm.
us, and the effect of a black hole where you are attracting,
Yeah, it
and
sucks
as it
every
attracts, it expands.
yeah,
And so we attract more trauma. So people end up with, complex trauma because this unhealed trauma just keeps attracting more and more and more and just keeps getting bigger and bigger, expanding and kind of overwhelming our lives. And so it's a very uncomfortable thing sometimes processing trauma. It was for me when it took me 30 years. It still makes me crazy to think about that. Like it
yeah,
took me 30 years to be willing, almost 30 years to be willing to go in and actually process the trauma from that 19-year-old girl that I was when I was abused. And it was such a like freeing experience. I was mad at myself for waiting so long. But I didn't understand. I didn't know. I tried therapy, but I was just doing talk therapy and that didn't do me any good. But when I actually did trauma processing and resolved the trauma from that, it was life-changing for me and resolved so many problems that I had, so many of the unhealthy coping mechanisms that I had been trying. So that's one of the things that I learned is a lot of the things that we look at as moral failings are are coping mechanisms.
Mm,
So people become alcoholics. They become food dependent. They're addicted to foods. They're a lot of times these are coping mechanisms for unhealed trauma. And we keep working on the surface stuff. We keep doing diets to try and, deal with the food problem, or we, and I'm not knocking AA is wonderful. Um, but if we don't actually resolve what caused us to use that coping mechanism in the first place, we're either going to continue to struggle with that one, or it's going to transfer to another one.
yeah.
And so you got to get to what's causing the problem in the first place and resolve that issue. And once I did that, all of those negative coping mechanisms that I had been trying for years to get rid of were just gone. Like I just didn't need them anymore. I didn't have any desire for them anymore. It was just gone.
It's hard because I think society is kind of set up. If I was a sociology major, and it's like the idea of like the microcosm and the macrocosm. So you have the
Yeah.
microcosm is like an individual, and the macrocosm is like the overall society. So if you have a social moray that says we don't talk about our hurt, we don't
Yeah.
talk about our feelings, we keep that down, and that's the moray. That's what you have to do. Well,
Yeah.
then you never resolve it, because if you don't resolve it, it builds up and then it explodes, and then you end up with a whole population in prison or
Yep.
in their own prison through addiction,
Yep.
or they get into different prisons. Like the prisons can be the prison of the mind or the physical prison. You can end up in both, either place or both.
Yeah.
So, like a lot of times, the construct is that you have to kind of be on the bell curve of that construct and like be willing to kind of be on the edge and say, well, no, I'm not going to. They say you should do that, but I don't have to do that because I have my own mind.
Yeah.
And then once you have your own mind, you say, I'm going to do what's good for me. I'm
Yeah.
not going to try to get along to go along.
Yeah.
You know, and it's hard because society tends to have the mores like get along to go along, and then you'll do something that hurts you
Yeah.
just
Well,
because like, that's where it's supposed to be. But it
and
doesn't
you're
have
right. It's very uncomfortable being a cycle breaker. It is not. It is really hard, and it's generational trauma in our societies, and it can be generational trauma. We can have um, trauma that's associated with the socioeconomic status that we're in. We can have trauma that's associated with our race. There's all kinds of different categories that we fall into that sometimes come with trauma, and and we have to be brave enough to face it and to be a cycle breaker. We don't want to keep perpetuating that. For me, there was intergenerational trauma that as I started doing therapy and healing, I started discovering, and this is not criticism of the family I grew up in. It was,
Mm,
those issues were come by honestly. I don't know how many generations back it went. But
mhm.
but once I recognized it, I thought I have got to stop this. I don't want to pass this down to my kids. I don't want my
Yeah,
grandchildren dealing with this. And it's the same thing, if whether it's within our race or whether it's, wherever it's coming from, we have to choose as an individual, like, how do I want to live? What do I want my legacy to be? How do I want to influence the people that are in my life? First I have to take care of myself, whatever that looks like. How do I take care of myself? How do I stop this trauma with me? How do I be the end point for that and not push it on to the next generation or push it on
and
to
that's
the,
like
to the people?
revolutionary. 'Cause
Yeah.
it's very revolutionary because a lot of times people think, well, that's selfish, right? So you get people would say, if you try to take care of yourself, that's selfish. It's not, or they wonder like, well, how did this person get to be exceptional? Well, they kind of went to the edge of that bell curve and they pushed it. And
Yeah.
even when people said they hated it, the people said they didn't like it, or why are you doing that? Why don't you just go with the flow? And people are like, I have to do this. And sometimes what happens is you lose friends, you'll lose certain
Yep.
things, but you gain other things.
Yeah.
And so you gain new perspective. You get the law of attraction. You get to where you need to be. Like if you were
Yeah.
living in this zone when you're young and you were falling into the wrong situations, and then you get out of that zone, well, people from that period are not going to probably be aligned with you anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're going to have a whole new group of people. If you keep on pining, why can't I get back to them? Well, you're going to go backwards.
Yeah.
You have to, like, if they can come up to where you are, if they can get into your frequency, that's cool. If they
Yeah.
can't, well, that's cool too, because like they're not on that frequency. So you go where you go.
Yeah. It's a painful process. It's not an easy thing to do because You do have to. There's, that story about the dog. I think it's like a dog that's laying on a porch and it's laying on a nail and it's howling over and over again. Have you ever heard
Mhm,
that story?
mhm.
And somebody comes up to the owner that's sitting on a rocking chair and they're asking him like, why doesn't he just move? And he's like, he's just comfortable the way he is. He just likes to complain. And I think that there's truth to that. There's we know it's I think change is scary for a lot of people, and the idea of like revisiting trauma is scary for a lot of people. And so we're like, I know, even though I don't like the way I'm living right now, I know this hard. I know
Yeah,
what
you
this
know
is
it.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
and
routine.
and what if, and you're afraid of what you don't know. But I can tell you, I avoided that trauma healing for over 25 years. It was only when I realized I was in a marriage counseling. My husband agreed to go to marriage counseling, and we were in a marriage counseling session, and I discovered that my unhealed trauma was impacting my husband and my marriage. And I was horrified. And once I realized that, I'm like, I have to do this. I have got to face this. And it was hard. It was the hardest thing that I had done by far. It was really hard. But I was so grateful I had done it. And like I said, I was mad at myself for taking so long, because I'm like, my gosh, I was suffering all these years and I didn't need to. Like, if I had
Yeah.
just understood what this was like, I would have done it years ago. I would not have put it off all this time.
Well, the
But
patterns, it's kinda like what happens like a codependency, like, people look at it and they say, "Well, how could you be in that relationship?" Well, that's what they know,
yeah,
and what you know becomes a routine, and you kinda
yeah,
get mapped into it, and even if it's a bad routine, it's what the routine you know,
yeah,
and you're more fearful of the routine than where that doesn't happen anymore. Well, I don't know how to live in a world that's not chaotic,
yeah,
right? They don't know how to live with peace of mind,
yeah,
right? So they'd rather be in the noise than get to the place where there's peace. And that
yep,
seems kind of counterintuitive, but the way our brains work is like we get people in these patterns and doesn't make logical sense all the time. It's like, well, why would you do that? Because it's not always logic coming into play. It's like
yeah,
you have to remap your brain to
yeah.
kind of move toward like why would I want to be there? It might take you 20 years to figure out you don't want to be there.
Well, and our
Because
subconscious mind is designed to protect us, and we don't really understand what that looks like. So the subconscious mind will keep you where it thinks is best, not necessarily the best thing for you, but where it thinks it's best. And a lot of times that means, like I said, it's also trying to resolve the trauma. So it keeps seeking out situations that it's familiar with and comfortable with, even though it doesn't feel good, because it's afraid of this other unknown. And, I for me with bipolar, I lived with those bipolar symptoms. I lived on a roller coaster for over a decade, and I was not comfortable with consistency. I longed
Mhm.
for it. I longed for just a steady life. I longed for consistency. I would look at like other moms that, had the same routine every day and everything went the same. And I would like, oh my gosh, what would that be? Like my poor kids. Like, they either get the really fun mom or the mom that can't get out of bed. But there was like hardly ever any in between. And anytime I was in that stable in between, I was anticipating, and I think probably creating the next mood swing,
Mhm.
because there was just like this fear I had. That I told my husband one time, I said, I have this feeling I'm going to go over a cliff anytime. And years later, I thought, I think I was creating some of those mood swings because I was
Mhm.
so uncomfortable with the steadiness. It took a long time for me to get comfortable with just routine and steadiness. And now I love it. Like my
Yeah.
life is, and it doesn't, it's not that your life is boring. My life is not boring at all. Like, I love my life now so much better than it was before, because the way that it was before was so out of control, and so I did so much damage. And my life now, I'm absolutely in control, and I can handle stress, I can handle challenges. We choose to have fun. It's not like chaotic, me coming up with really weird ideas kind of fun. It's like, let's choose to go on a hike. Let's choose to go to this fun activity. Let's choose to do these things, and I'm
Mm.
fully present and I feel everything, instead of the unwell kind of fun that we used to have that always ended in a crash and, depression for weeks afterwards.
Yeah, this remapping your brain to
Yeah,
kinda get to that place is the crucible kind of like, that's the hard thing. It's always
yeah,
hard work, and a lot of
yeah,
times, we live in a society, people like, "Oh, the 5 steps and you're set." 12
Yeah.
steps and you're set. And like you take this supplement and you're set. Like nothing's ever that easy.
No.
There's always a lot of hard work. You look at anybody that actually gets anywhere, there's no overnight like success story. Usually it's step by step.
Yeah.
People make mistakes, and you gotta, it's every day you learn something until you're not here, right? And every day you
Well,
get better. And you might make a slip, but it's like that's the way it is. But some people
yeah.
are like, "Oh, as soon as I make a slip, I'm all done." It's like
Yeah.
that's not. You can't like. You have to think like you have to be more
Yeah.
willing to deal with the happy accident or the
Well,
so-called
and
mistake.
just learn from it. When I was first going through the healing process, I had this image of myself climbing a mountain. And so anytime I would experience any kind of symptoms, I would feel like I was failing. It felt like chutes and ladders where I would be going up and then I'd land on a slide and slide back down to the beginning. And I had a really great conversation with my therapist one time when she said, that's the wrong way to look at this. She talked about the addiction recovery cycle. And she said, it really looks more like this, where with the addiction recovery cycle, you don't want to focus on, pre-contemplation and contemplation, or when you don't really take ownership for the problem. So you want to eliminate those steps from the cycle, but you have, that you've made the decision to heal, and then you're taking action, and then you get to, you take the action, you get to maintenance, and then you might have a day when you end up with symptoms again and you slide back, and I call those learning points. It's not
Mhm.
failure. It's not even relapse. You're just learning. What can you learn from that? Why did you experience those symptoms? For me, that was super valuable information because that was when I started identifying triggers. Like what triggered that? Why did that trigger depression? Why did that trigger a hypomanic, state in me?
Yeah, it's a better.
And yeah, and as I learned those things, then I could take it back to my therapist and say, okay, I had this experience and it triggered this in me, and then we could kind of dig down and figure out where's the trigger coming from, what's causing that emotional disruption. And so instead of looking at it like failure, you look at it like information. Symptoms are just information, just like emotions. They're trying to tell you something. If we can learn to listen to what the symptoms are saying and give it what it needs to heal, then we can heal our brains and live healthy lives.
That's a good way to look at it because, like, the all or nothing, you get that kind of alpha male, like, oh, if
Yeah.
you don't stick to the plan, you got to start scrap and start all over again.
Yeah.
Where, like, I look at it as like, I'm a musician, right? And I'm recording something, I make a mistake, I hit the wrong key. It's like, well, that's a happy accident.
Yeah.
I might be able to actually take that and drive the song to a new direction. So it could be something like, well, that didn't work, but it could lead me in a totally different direction. And I just like you live in a kind of present state, present moment, kind of process, it's flow state, and there's no wrong note.
Yeah.
It's actually just an opportunity. Like if you look at it as that's not a bad note. That's an opportunity to kind of change my path.
Yeah.
And if you take that kind of musical idea and like if you run into something you think you hit the bad note, you hit the bad turn, well, you could turn it into an opportunity. It's a lesson learned.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And if you have that, it's like the glass full, glass empty. It's like it's a different perspective. You start different using different mindsets, and then you're not failing.
Yeah.
You know, you're actually winning. Every day that you're here, you're still winning. So I'm a
Yeah.
cancer
Absolutely.
survivor. So every day I'm here
Um,
is a win.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's fantastic. Yes. I love that. That's so true. I think that if we can recognize that healing takes time, and each day that we learn something new, that's progress towards healing, right? And that just keep in mind that as you grow, as you heal, as you learn, you're gathering more information that's going to help you stay in maintenance mode longer. It's going to help you stay in a balanced state longer. You get more comfortable with that. And eventually you'll get to a point like I don't experience symptoms anymore. It's been a long time since I experienced symptoms, and I've had some pretty gnarly challenges come up, and I can take it in stride now because I've learned how to handle life, and I've learned how to regulate my emotions
Yeah.
and give my brain what it needs to live in a healthy way.
Yeah, just understanding your triggers and
Yeah.
understanding like how you work. Like it's got that the looking glass self analysis where it takes work
Yeah.
to actually take the time so then you can be present for everybody else. It's like for yourself first, and then
Yeah.
then you can be present for other people.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the lesson that you continue to learn from the guests that come on the show. And I want to thank you again for being on the show. We always hit like the hour mark
Yeah.
faster than we ever think. But again, we have the myupsideofdown.com and /free. If people go to that link, what do they find there?
It's called a mood cycle survival guide. So this is the first step in healing is learning how to manage your mood swings effectively. As you're going through the healing journey, like we said, it takes time and you'll have learning points where you'll experience symptoms. And so instead of just letting those things happen to you and feeling like a victim, if you develop a mood cycle survival guide, it helps you learn how to take responsibility for those times when you're struggling with depression or mania and come up with a plan so that you can manage them effectively and get back to a balanced, healthy state faster.
That's awesome. I do want to let people know that's going to be fully clickable. We're on all the major podcast platforms where you can watch or listen to a podcast. We were live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. And I want to thank you again for being a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. It was really great. I love talking to people from around the world, and we get a chance to hear different points of view and experiences. And I believe your experience that you've relayed to everybody tonight is very powerful and will help people. And that's the point of doing the show. But thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been an awesome discussion. I really enjoyed it.